and it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica White, who's going to moderate this panel. Jessica has somewhat of a sort of more established educational relationship with McGraw-Hill, where she works, but also more relevant for this specific topic here. She runs her own social entrepreneurship charity and runs courses for refugees as part of that program. Jessica?
Okay, hello again. Yes, this is going to be a social impact of education technology. So this panel mainly explores the positive impact of EdTech initiatives and how these can contribute towards improving the educational achievement and developing student skills for 21st century success. So I'd like to welcome to the stage, to begin with, Isabel Newman. Isabel is an Associate Investment Director of Nesta Impact Investments in the UK. I'm sure some of you have heard this is a very well-established fund. Isabel is an Associate Investment Director that works with the Nesta Impact Investments of 17.6 million, and it's focused in London, but throughout the country. She leads the thematic and investment activities in the education and employability sectors, but particularly with a focus on the products and services that improve the outcomes of disadvantaged children and young people. Nesta's impact investments also have a portfolio of 5 investments in this space, including Arbor Education, Cogbooks, and Get My First Job. So prior to joining Nesta, Isabel worked as a CAF Venture Sum, which is a social investment fund that provides unsecured loan financing to charities and social enterprises, and in the international grants at Comic Relief. I'd like to give a round of applause. Okay, and moving on, then we have Tariq Fancy. Would you like to come to the stage? He's the founder of Rumie. Rumie uses technology and leapfrog global access to education. Rumie was founded in 2013 and named the world's best social startup of late 2014, and is the subject of a 30-page Harvard Business case review that was actually published in 2016 that some of you have probably used. Fancy previously worked in technology investment in banking in the Silicon Valley before becoming the youngest partner of a New York private equity firm, where he led early investments to leapfrog landlines and mobile phones in developing countries. Fancy has published also an academic research on fostering innovation. He holds a BA from Brown University and a master's in Sao Paulo in Paris. I'd also like to welcome to the stage Paul Vincent Cable. Paul is the co-founder and CEO of EnSo UK. Paul's focus over the past 18 years has been in education as a vehicle for sustainable and peaceful societies. He has pursued this as an educator and also as another role as a producer, advocate, and also an entrepreneur. He is chairman of UNESCO schools in UK and the co-producer of the Humanitarian Water and Food Awards, and is a trustee of NGOs and co-creator of 100 Hours. So I'd like to start with this very good panel that's based on social entrepreneurship here. I'd like to start off the panel with perhaps Isabel. Her focus is very much on the mix of private and public funds, and I'd like to, if you could just tell the audience a little bit about how that works with your most recent startups or social startups that you're working with at present.
Sure, thanks everyone for attending and joining us for the last session of the day. We'll try and keep it interesting until your drinks in, I think, about half an hour. So, as per the introduction, I work for a fund called Nesta Impact Investments. We're part of a larger charity called Nesta, which is a kind of, it's a charity whose objects are all around innovation for public benefit, and so education is one of the areas that we work in. And we have a think tank and also a kind of grant-making lab, which makes our jobs as investors quite a lot easier because we have a lot of information around kind of trends and future thinking, and also a pipeline of upcoming innovations that have been kind of grant-funded by Nesta as well. So as an investor in a privileged position when it comes to sort of knowing what's going on in the education space and trying to identify some really great opportunities. And in terms of kind of how we approach combining investment with creating social impact. It's no easy thing to do. It's certainly a tricky area, and it's a tricky area to do it well, I think. And I suppose very, very simply, I won't go into kind of the detail of the methodology too much. Maybe if there's kind of questions around that, we can talk about it. But simply put, we're all around kind of trying to reduce inequality in educational attainment. And so what we're trying to do kind of pre-investment is understand the problem in a lot of detail. So kind of just understanding there's an attainment gap isn't really sufficient. We need to understand why it is, where it is, what subjects it in. Is it geographic? Is it, what are the trends that we can understand? So having a really good understanding of the problem, much like anybody who develops a product, I suppose, is really important to us. And then I suppose the next phase of our thinking is around understanding what the most effective interventions are. There's a huge body of evidence around what works in education, what's effective. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and there's a huge amount we can learn from. And so when we're looking at investing in companies, we're always asking them, why did you do that? What's that based on? What evidence is that based on? Why would you make that kind of decision to design your product in that certain way? Because ultimately we need to at least root these products in the most promising evidence. And there's an interesting trade-off between innovation and kind of basing things in evidence. You don't want to just kind of keep churning out the same things, but at least kind of bedding in knowing what works is a good start. And then I think that probably the third and most critical thing when it comes to investing is that we look to find companies where their impact success and their commercial success are completely aligned. So we're looking for companies who kind of, creation of impact is kind of one of the key KPIs on their dashboard. It goes right alongside sales, alongside all the other things they're monitoring. And so to find those entrepreneurs who rate impact is of such significant importance, but also kind of when it comes down to it, when there's tough decisions to be made, impact won't be the first thing to go if it is kind of really, really nicely aligned with commercial. So that's kind of how we, I suppose, try and approach that tricky ground of blending kind of public, private, commercial, social, and the kind of I guess ultimately our goal of finding great companies that we can get a financial and a social return out of.
Great. So maybe we could move on to perhaps how Rumie is measured in terms of the impact that it's making, perhaps with public funding, with private funding, but then also in the communities that it's working with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, just to give people a sense of what Rumie actually, what we're trying to do here, there's a lot been made in the last few years of the fact that basic educational materials have become free online. So I'm just judging by the looks of the people in the room. I think a lot of them are at least as old as I am and will remember that encyclopedias used to cost $1,000, 12 years ago. And that's just the beginning. Basically, anything you learned under the age of 18, you can find some materials to learn that for free online today. And a lot of people have made the connection that the greatest opportunity that is to bring all that free learning content to the bottom of the pyramid, right, where there are children who are fundamentally capable but have math and reading scores, 40 or 50% below because they lack access, because they lack resources. And it was mentioned in the intro, I'd worked many years ago on bringing mobile phones into emerging markets. In my prior career, I used to be I was the first technology banker, so we'd worked on Google and Amazon's IPO. And at some point, saw the potential for mobile phones when they started to become adopted widely in developed countries to bring mobile phones to emerging markets. And the simple idea was that from a human impact perspective, that basic Nokia mobile phone, people here saw that as a revelation because you could, walk around and text friends, from a mobile perspective. But the real opportunity wasn't, us going from landlines to mobile devices. It was that at a certain price point, when there was enough scale, the cost would come down that you could take that and deliver it to places that never had landlines in the first place, right? And they went from nothing at all to something great. So that's our view of education, of the free education technology tools online. It's not, the real human opportunity isn't really delivering it, where I grew up in Canada, or in the US or in the UK. There'll be marginal gains, there's no question, but it's really delivering it to the, the billion kids underserved in education around the world. With that in mind, when we look at impact, I think there's a fundamental challenge with measuring. I think measuring impact is very difficult. Having worked in the finance space, I can see how numbers can be easily made to say what you want them to say, right? Every investment banker basically goes in knowing what they want their financial model to say, and then they basically make the assumptions and numbers all work for that. And that's in an area where you have a very clear currency, which is dollars or pounds sterling or whatever, and a very clear accounting system, or in theory a clear accounting system to get to a bottom line. Measuring impact is difficult. You don't have a clear, currency, right? Because is it lives touched? Is it, there's all these different metrics I've seen that some of them are a bit loose. And you also don't have a clear accounting system. So it's very challenging to see different organizations using different methods. Our view of that is pretty simply, if we can take things that people need, and we know they need, and we can make them cost 1/100th of what they used to cost, that's a good start. And so when we started our first programs in Haiti, we're now in 15 countries, we basically took a full curriculum of content comprised of open license materials. We preloaded them onto a device that had enough storage space that it worked offline. Storage space is very, very cheap, right? You can add 8 gigs for a few dollars. And we just had them work offline, and the power costs are extremely low. And the idea was that there was a valuation done that there was $5,000 to $10,000 worth of content, or at least what used to cost $5,000 to $10,000 on a $50 device. So for us, that was the beginning of impact. Now, of course, we have a lot more elaborate systems of doing it. But even when we measure impact, one of my views is that we can just sell the device, right? We'll sell it at cost because we're structured as a nonprofit. But if people are willing to buy it, that's to me the greatest sign that it's adding value to them. It's the market test. I think it's very, very difficult to go across contexts and measure it accurately because it can be done, but it's not easy.
So if we're moving on to Paul now, and Paul, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how you have measured that kind of impact, particularly with the schools, the UNESCO schools in the UK, and also as a co-producer.
Sure. I'll just back up a bit with it, just to give you an understanding of the problems that we're trying to solve. So if you go into a slum in Nairobi or Arusha or almost any city in Africa, as you walk into a school, you'll see 4 distinct problems, 2 of which get talked about more than the other 2. So the first one is very often the class will be super overcrowded. There might be like 100 kids in the class. The teacher often is somebody who themselves left school when they were 12, 13, 14 years old, and have still got that same subject knowledge that they had acquired by then. And then another problem is what they call teacher absenteeism. So quite often you walk into the classroom and literally the teacher is not actually there. And there are lots of reasons for that, but some people think that more than 40% of all instructional time is lost because of teacher absenteeism. So simply delivering the curriculum in the classroom is really hard in a lot of places in sub-Saharan Africa, and you see this problem in India and various other places as well. So that's problem number 1. But here's the thing, even if you solve that, and as many of you know, there's phenomenal EdTech already being deployed in Africa, which is really having an important impact. If the child is sick, sufficiently sick that they can't even attend school, or they're sick that they can go to school but they just don't feel good, that obviously has a massive impact on their ability to learn. And there are a handful of very solvable problems affecting their health. So, for example, children typically breathe in kerosene fumes when they're at home because almost 1.5 billion people in that part of the world use kerosene as their main source of fuel. Drinking dirty water, not being able to wash their hands are also really important problems. And then basically being malnourished. If you've got 1 meal a day, typically your iron levels are low, so it means you're tired. Your iodine levels are low, which actually knocks points off your IQ. So health is a huge, or has a huge impact on children's ability to learn. A third problem, which is the one in a way closest to my heart, and it's the one that I've worked on the most over the past 10, 15 years, including with UNESCO, is even if you do all of that right, so you give the child a great academic background, you help them be healthy, how do you help the child bounce back from all the suffering that might happen in their lives? Let's say a loved one dies. So how do you give them that kind of resilience? How do you give them the courage to take action to do things that are really important in their lives? How do you give them the integrity to make hard ethical decisions? How do you give them the empathy to have relationships that work, that don't cause them a lot of suffering at home and at work? How do you give them the commitment to really soldier through all of the problems that life throws at us? So we've worked very hard on that particular piece. And then a fourth one, and it's related to that, is typically children go through quite a lot of stress at home, so through emotional stuff that happens, through dysfunctional relationships at home, or more seriously physical and sexual abuse as well. And that particularly impacts children. So what we've worked on, and what we are working on, in fact, what we're launching this summer, is what we feel is a kind of like an all-in-one approach to education in Africa, and actually it's relevant to anywhere in the developing world, which has solutions to each of these particular problems. And the way we've approached that is to build a consortium of best-in-class providers, whether it's EdTech, for example, Avanti will provide our broadband satellite internet, where some of you will have heard from Eric earlier today, and then from Wiz Education as well on the math side. We've got a terrific provider on the healthcare side, Access Happier. And then the notion is to actually leverage the school to retail solutions to the health problems. So for example, rather than people burning kerosene, they use solar power. So for example, we've got Bbox as a partner there, and Unilever as a partner on the hygiene side. So that's our model, and so we've tested all the different pieces of this, and so I'm super excited that over the summer we will actually have the first fully working model of this altogether.
That's great. So it sounds like there's a lot of initiatives going with local partners. So I'd just like to then go over to Tarek, and if you could tell us a little bit more about your local partners that you've worked with Rumie, and then we can go on to the spell.
Yeah, well, so they are generally anyone running a school. So they'll be NGOs or the Ministry of Education. We started largely with NGOs, and the simple reason for that is that talking to the Ministry of Education in a country can take 2 years, or it's a long time to actually get something done. And we are very much, the way we develop a product is like it's a lean startup methodology, right? It's the idea is that you may have a vision in 5 years. You think that your product will have 100 features, but you isolate the 1 or 2 most key critical features that you think that it ought to have. You build it around that, and then you've developed what's called an MVP, or a minimum viable product, and you put it in the hands of users. And from that point on, your product development is actually driven by the users. And that escapes what is one of the biggest, I'd say, challenges, risks in product development, especially in technology, that you sit in the lab for 5 years dreaming up what you think the world wants, and then you're finished, and then it turns out that they didn't really want that. And that's one of the issues with one laptop per child. They didn't really do field trials, and they spent years building this perfect laptop, and then by the time they were finished, Intel and other people had made better and cheaper alternatives, and they realized that it wasn't really solving a problem that needed to be solved. In our case, we wanted to get it in the hands of children as fast as possible in school systems, and then ask them for feedback and say, well, first of all, we figure out some of the known issues, which are that people ask obvious questions. If you put devices in kids' hands, do they break? Do they get stolen? Simple things. So we would have answers to those. And then we would start to figure out how do we make it better by asking people in the field. So, for example, at first they said we locked it down so you couldn't install games onto a device. Then, through working with teachers on the ground, they said, well, actually, why don't you put games on it, but give us control over letting children play the games as a reward, as an incentive. So we started building that. And so every step of the way, we were engaging communities through our partners, and teachers and so on, to figure out what are the next most important features as defined by the people actually using it. Now, to that end, that meant that we had to find partners that would move reasonably fast. And so we launched at a UNICEF Innovation Unit conference in New York at the end of 2013. And then we saw this massive demand, since, of course, we had people had self-selected themselves by being at that conference. And over time, we started now working with a lot of large global NGOs, because at some point they see results that make sense at affordable price points. But I think a lot of it is finding the fastest movers and your early adopters, and then working with them to develop the product. And then eventually the other ones, the big governments and so on, will take a few years and get involved. And probably after 5 more years, the UN will get involved.
So the message is faster at a micro level and slow at a macro level.
Convinced, I think, when you can show that it's working in some context. I mean, otherwise, I don't know how to convince the macro level beyond, lots and lots of research. I think it's critical to be able to show them, look, it's working. With someone who's willing to give it a shot.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. Isabel, perhaps could you follow on from that, and how does Nesta work with that? It's obviously a very large impact-focused investment fund, and how do you cope with that sort of speed? On the micro level, everything needs to work fast. On a macro level, you need time, research, efficacy studies, and so on. How do you balance the two?
Yeah, it's a good question and a really live issue for us. I want to start off by just kind of challenging something you said, and there hasn't been enough disagreement here today, so I'm going to try and spice up our session and say, I guess, in your first comment you mentioned that people kind of buying or using your product on the ground was enough for you to be confident in the first instance that it was working and it was popular. And I guess I would just really challenge how accurate that is in terms of a statement. And I can see, you have to start somewhere, and sales is an indicator that something's successful, but this might be a bit of a hopeless analogy, but thinking on the spot, things that are engaging and really enjoyable. So like a chocolate bar is really enjoyable and really delicious, and I'll spend lots of money on it, but it's not good for me. And I think kind of we have to think of the kind of moral obligation we have when we're putting educational tools in the hands of people who in some instances don't have anything better, but in others there's a range of products out there that they could be using. And we have to be really careful that the things we are putting in the hands of young people are as effective as they can possibly be. A hand shot up. It's not quite right, but...
They're screwing up halfway through the intervention. And you should be delivering fit for purpose, solid state computers, no fans, no dust can get in, no humidity. They don't screw up over the first course of the year and put teachers and kids off using technology. You shouldn't opt for the second best
Absolutely
scenario.
not.
You really should be giving top level. I kind of question the impact thing about assessing impact in literacy and numeracy as well, but
Okay,
I'll get onto that later.
Yeah, it's an absolutely, it's a big kind of and complicated area, and to that end I agree, kind of you do need to, many organizations, you need to find like simple ways of measuring your impact at the same time as perhaps developing the kind of the longer term trials as well. I just guess the point I'm trying to make is that sales and use are not the same as impact and efficacy, and I think we have to be really careful not to kind of conflate the two. And I think that the point that the next question around micro and macro, I think, is a good kind of way of reflecting that, in that on a day-to-day level, organizations, EdTech startups, you need to do kind of rapid testing. You kind of we call it rapid cycle testing. But it's a part of your day-to-day product development, kind of constantly changing and challenging and understanding what's working, what's not, and that does need to be rapid, because products develop a lot more quickly than you can measure impact. On the other hand, we're seeing lots of companies in parallel to that doing kind of really academic-led randomized control trials, where we can actually over a number of years get really robust evidence that's a really good level of it has a good level of integrity, it's really reliable around whether something's effective or not. So I think the two do need to be done in parallel. You can't sit back and wait 3 years to work out if your product works or not. I completely see that, because that's too late, it's too long. The product's already out there in the hands of the users. You need to know that if it's working more quickly than that. But I think the two things have to be done in parallel, because I think just doing the short-term testing is not sufficient, because it's just not deep enough.
I mean, so I don't actually disagree. It's not that I don't think impact testing is important. I get the sense that a lot of funders and people in the space are mixed up in a pretzel about two very different ideas that are both independently good but don't make sense when mixed. And those are, one, the idea of evidence-based testing, impact, RCTs. I think that's fantastic. I think that programs that have been around for many years should be tested. That's one idea. The second idea is the nonstop talk about innovation. We need innovation. We need big thinking. We need game-changing ideas. Often that, of course, involves technology. Those are two great ideas independently. They don't work when you mix them, because it is impossible to show long-term impact studies for something that is innovative. Like, put it this way, I've had conversations with funders and they said, this is great, you know, can you show me a 5-year impact study? And I said, I thought you wanted to back innovation. And they said, yes. And I said, well, nothing that is innovative comes with a 5-year impact study attached. Otherwise, it wouldn't be innovative anymore. And this is a conversation you don't need to have, to be honest, in Silicon Valley. Like, one of our backers is founded Yahoo Mail, or sold it to Yahoo and it became Yahoo Mail. And I was giving a presentation, and I kept talking about our early impact data. And he said, look, and he basically just told me to get out of the presentation. And he told me multiple times. He finally said, look, over here, you don't need to convince people that, you know, about impact. If you can take an entire curriculum and put it onto a device that costs less than one K-12 textbook and that has data analytics and gamification, then people are going to get it. And in a sense, what he's really saying is that you know, people are willing to take risk. They don't know for sure if there's long-term impact, but there is no innovation without risk. Someone has to take a risk at some point to back something that's going to become the next Google or the next, you know, Facebook or whatever. And in the nonprofit space, I haven't seen that same appetite for risk. And without taking on risk, there's going to be no innovation. So to be clear, I don't think that impact testing is bad. I think it's fantastic, and I think that it's very, very applicable in many situations where you have programs that have been done for many, many years. There are billions of dollars being spent on them. Of course, they should be tested, and people should figure out what works and what doesn't. But at the same time, I think that the world needs lots of solutions that are game changers, right? That you don't need incremental change, you need revolutionary change to educate 1 billion kids who are underserved in education around the world. And that requires a lot of risk-taking. And what I've tended to find was that sometimes the application of this impact testing and evidence-based approach was, in my view, misapplied to things that could not possibly have shown impact because, you know, they were trying something that was risky and new.
Okay. We're actually running a little bit out of time, so just to address like a bit more to the audience as well, what their questions are. Do we have any questions around some of the issues that were raised on impact, micro, macro, and funding, and also the products, the robustness of these products? Has anyone got a question? Okay, so if we perhaps then go on to Paul, and maybe if you could share with us a little bit more, because we missed out you at the end, to understand, you're also, I know you're very present in Africa, and perhaps as well then you can build upon what this gentleman was saying in the audience. How do you feel about those kinds of how to build in a quick way and then to roll out? Could you share your experience with us a bit more?
Yes, so we've approached it in 2 ways. So one is stuff that is not our expertise. So maths would be an example, right? So my view about it and the approach that we've taken is to work with companies that, or organizations in general, that have a product in Africa with, you know, basic pyramid children, you know, so they're from families earning less than, you know, $8, $9, $10 a day, and their maths standard is improving beyond, considerably beyond what one would expect if they were in a typical school. So, for example, you know, Erica was speaking later, the partnership that Avanti have got with Wiz Education, which is our maths partner in Kenya, has been going a little while now, and you can clearly see the results. So the children are just using the software, and you know, for an hour a week, right? So it's not that much, but you can see very, very clear and measurable improvement in that particular space. The other space, which, as I was saying earlier, I'm very close to, but which is seriously hard to measure, is, you know, this heart space. So how do you measure the impact on a child of really getting empathy? So, you know, the way that we teach empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, hearing with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. So when a child really gets how to see another child in the class who's suffering in some way, you know, it could be because somebody in their family died, or it could be because they're struggling with a maths, or whatever it is, and they feel that, and so they go to that child and they help them. How do you measure that? You know, so I've had a whole bunch of somewhat frustrating conversations with people in the measurement space about this. So as an educator, it seems clear. You can just look in the child's eyes and you can hear the stories. It's obvious whether you've made a difference or not. And so we tend to rely on stories, anecdotes, basically qualitative evidence on that. So yeah, it's a tricky one, the whole measurement thing, and the debate that's going on is definitely evidence of that. And I don't have any fantastic answers to it. I'm just mindful that it's hard to get it right, and especially the less tangible things are really, really hard to measure.
So we have like a complicated issue between qualitative and quantitative measuring that I'm sure that all of you can continue after this panel. So I'd like to thank you for attending, and thanks to Isabel and to Paul and to Tarek. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.